Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to be getting started in about 5 minutes. So if you got last chance to take a comfort break or grab a couple snacks or drinks, check your cell phones as well, and then prepare to get started here in a few minutes. Thanks. All right, guys, we'll go ahead and get started today. We'll go ahead and start on time, 1300. What we got, first of all, welcome to everybody to our inaugural Strategy and Warfare Center Symposium titled Future Conflict and Disruptive Technology. And we'll have 2.5 days of just some great engagement and speakers and panels for everybody. I'm Colonel Rob Grant, and I'll be kind of emceeing or leading the program throughout the rest of the next few days. But before we get into all of the grand welcoming and administration and things like that, I'd like to welcome Colonel Tom Swain. He's permanent professor and head of the Department of Military and Strategic Studies, who will get us started by providing opening remarks. Thanks.
Well, good afternoon, warfighter scholars. It is wonderful to have you here. On behalf of the Superintendent, General Clark, and the Dean, Brigadier General Latendra, we are really excited to have you here for what we hope to be some very enlightening and informative events over the next 2.5 days. I would like to point out that many of you are familiar with the Strategy and Warfare Center already, which sits within our Department of Military and Strategic Studies. We'll talk to you briefly and give you an introduction of that here shortly. But for those of you that have played in the multi-domain laboratory, you're well aware of the simulator and the integrated learning endeavors we do there. What you might not be as familiar with is the other half of our Strategy and Warfare Center, which is the research endeavors. And what the Strategy and Warfare Center Symposium is designed to do is to really introduce you, the customer, the client, the cadet body, both here and in the ROTC universe, what that research side looks like as well. So we did that this year with a focus on disruptive technology and its application to future conflict. I would like to first start off with some thank yous. Biggest thank you to our partners at Raytheon, who very generously provided some funding, all the funding for this. And we're incredibly grateful to them and for their participation. Because this is going to have a ripple effect into years, if not decades, as you carry some of these lessons learned forward out of here. I am not going to introduce all of our distinguished visitors and illustrious presenters. We will be introducing them before each panel or fireside chat or keynote speech. But my special thanks definitely goes out to them for traveling here and joining us. We have representatives coming here to share their thoughts and perspectives from DoD, deep and broad, from industry partners, from academia, and then of course from the USAF faculty as well. I would very much like to thank my Strategy and Warfare Center staff members over here, especially Eyeball Grant, Trey Darnell, and hiding in the back row there, Fuego Gospel. They'll talk to you more shortly, but they have been my A3 and my A8 to get this entire show on the road and set up. And if any failure results out of this, I take complete blame, but I know it will all be a success, and it was totally due to their efforts. I would also most like to thank the cadets that are here, the USAF cadets, but especially the ROTC cadets. It is wonderful having you here, both here, and realize for those in the audience, there could be hundreds plus that are also plugged in online, and this is going to be recorded. And it's going to have a broad reach and footprint out there into the Air Force ROTC environment as well. It is really good to have you here. I'm an ROTC product. I went to Auburn way back a long time ago. I can distinctly remember after class in January, February of '91, going to my buddy's trailer and hoping something from Desert Storm would be on CNN at that hour. Pre-internet, pre-cell phone, pre-PowerPoint, and about 3 or 4 channels of worthwhile viewing on the TV. I so craved something like this. I was so hungry for what the real military and the real Air Force and the real future would look like. And it was very limited what we had access to back then. So I am just so happy that you're here and that you have the ability to look into the present, but really into the future. What the contemporary and future fight and the technology that we're going to bring into that fight is going to look like. What I'm hopeful for is you're going to come out of this with kind of 3 things, 3 different mind shifts for you as you leave. The first thing I really hope settles into your brains is how integrated and interdisciplinary future conflict and disruptive technology is. You are all in a major and you're studying diligently on your own railroad track, and that's wonderful. But that's fake. Departments and majors and disciplines are all words and compartments that we have built because it's easier to organize our professors and our funding. The real world, it all mixes. It's a giant bucket of tangled fishing line, and everything touches everything else. So you'll see that the technology, and the strategy, and the morality, the planning, the execution, the assessment, those are all interwoven. And that sense of complexity and integration is a major theme that I hope you recognize coming out of this. Second thing I hope for you is I hope you feel a little unsettled. I hope you experience a little bit of cognitive dissonance and you feel a little bit shaky, a little uncertain. I want you to listen and to process what you're hearing and to think about what the threat is developing and is arraying against you, and to be a little bit worried about that. And I want you to look at what we're developing and how we're thinking about we're going to use it to project power and make effects on our adversaries. And I want you to be a little awestruck and maybe a little intimidated about that endeavor and the immensity that you're about to inherit, and to be responsible for developing, planning, executing, and moving forward. But the third thing that I really hope out of this, and this gets back to our Strategy and Warfare Center mission, is I want you to leave with a sense of inquiry, curiosity. I'm hoping that you leave here with way more questions than answers, and that you have this spark and this energy and this motivation to go out and start finding those answers and thinking about the hard questions that we haven't even defined yet. Because it's really not about finding the answers. For you, it's really more about defining the next generation of questions as we research and dig deeper and deeper into what's available, how we're going to protect ourselves from it, and how we're going to use that to employ effects on our adversaries. So with that, I will turn it over to Colonel Eyeball Grant and Lieutenant Colonel Fuego Gasipol, my two right-hand troopers. Eyeball is my chair of Air Power Innovation and Integration, and he has largely been responsible for getting this conference set up. Air Battle Manager by trade, AWACS time, Weapons School instructor, CAOC, School of Advanced Military Studies, Inserlook Command, PhD at Naval Postgraduate, and just an all-around good guy. Very, very lovable, and we'll never let him leave. The teddy bear of our department. The yin to his yang, walking up the stairs over there, is Lieutenant Colonel Fuego Gasipol. He's the bad cop of the gang. Fuego's a B-1 pilot, later a Reaper Squadron commander. He comes with that air-to-ground mindset, also weapons school. Fuego is the director of the Strategy and Warfare Center. So this entire endeavor, all the troops, all the money, all the labs, all the research falls under him. And truly, I just show up and make the popcorn. So with that, gents, I will turn it over to you and we'll get started. Thank you so much for everything.
All right, we're moving on. All right, a couple things before I get started. Go to the next slide, please. Got some administration things to cover, but again, I like to echo what Colonel Swaim said. Thanks and welcome to all our ROTC participants, both here and online, plus any of our faculty that might be listening in as well via remote. Also, thanks to Raytheon for again helping provide the funding and the gifts to be able to put this on. So just a couple things for just orientation for everybody as they come and go throughout the next couple days, kind of orienting you to the forum. So welcome to Polaris Hall. And again, also thanks to the Polaris Hall staff who has been really helping make this thing come together, particularly from the obviously the room itself, but all the tech that's going on behind it as well. So you'll notice there are refreshments and tables of snacks and drinks and everything in the back. Please take advantage of it and enjoy it. That's there for you. Do not leave here hungry. And the only thing we ask, I think you already seen the signs, that you don't bring food or drink down into the main auditorium area here as well. You've been given name badges. Please wear those while you're in the area. For those that, all my cadets, we're not going to give you name badges. We're going to use our area badges for that same purpose in that regard. So just kind of helps us with accountability and things like that. If you haven't already figured out, Arnold Hall is over here to kind of back corner. There are food courts over there. There's a coffee place over there as well. But obviously you got all, hopefully, you take advantage of the stuff that's here as well. If we have an emergency for whatever reason and need to evacuate the building, we will go back out these double doors through Arnold Hall and out to the main parking lot on the other side. Closest restrooms are going to be right around the corner over here to my right and your left on that corner, but there's also restrooms again right over in Arnold Hall available for everybody as well. So right now things we're going to be having a lot of changeover with cadets coming in and going throughout the symposium. The alignment of the schedule is pretty much lined to the class schedule. Today, there was a lot of conflicts with particularly things like commandant and some development training time and some other events that are going on today throughout. But as the conference continues on through the next Thursday and Friday, we expect that the place is going to fill up a little bit more, and a lot of those SCAs that are going to help cover participation is going to kind of kick in. But that being said, do come and go as you need to, please. And just recognize if you know you're going to have to leave, please, I just ask that then you just kind of sit in a place that might be advantageous for you being able to dismiss as required. Also along those lines, when we have guest speakers coming in, we're not going to be calling the room to attention and doing standard protocol in that regard, just to help facilitate the mixed audience that we have. But obviously we'll be providing a warm welcome and a warm clap to those as they come and go off the stage. All right, let's see here. Make sure I've already kind of covered cell phones a little bit when we, as you guys were taking your seats, but again, just make sure you do have your cell phones off. And I would also ask that you kind of keep any sidebars to a minimum, because we are recording this live and it is getting, is going out both concurrently, but it'll also be recorded for later posting. So when we do ask questions, when you have questions as the Q&A moments come up, you'll see mics that are on the left and right to you. So please go and use those mics for that purpose. So again, we're capturing for people that are online as well to be able to hear what those questions are. We will have questions that probably come in from our online viewers as well. So Lieutenant Johnson's going to be helping facilitate that from his seat over there. And so we'll also be getting those that way. Let's see, let me make sure I got covered. Anything else? We do, it's going to be all on class here as well, kind of as the bold underlined word ends up there. So again, watch conversations that are going to be happening in here as well and keep it at that level. And then what I'd like to also, next slide, kind of highlight the area here. So you see all of these breakout rooms that are on the left and right around the area. We have access to those and we're able to use those throughout the entire symposium. So during breaks and or even if there's a conversation that you really need to have with a speaker afterwards, or they want to continue having a sidebar, those are great rooms to do those in as well, okay? And then I think I've already pointed out Arnold Hall, and that'll be about it. So next slide, please. So I'd like to do is shift gears for a second here with you and kind of talk a little bit about the history of the Strategy and Warfare Center and how it came about and why we are here today. So you'll see a really good question up there. Colonel Swain loves to tell this story, and I'm going to steal it from him here for a second. He tells the story about one day when he was about 2017, he was walking down the hall with one of his cadets, and after class, and you know, the cadet kind of seemed down, he's kind of a little dejected, and he's kind of maybe doing the Charlie Brown shuffle a little bit. And he's just like, and Colonel Swain was like, he sees there's something not right. He's like, hey, what's going on? And he's like, well, sir, you know, I'm here at the academy. I'm a 2 degree. It's been a long time. And I thought the academy was going to be the Hogwarts of air power, and I just don't see it. I know we got a lot of cool stuff we get to do. We get to do jump. We get to do some trainers. We get to, you know, kind of see some airmanship and things like that. And this place is really cool, but I'm not getting to see how it all connects, how it all comes together, to see it, touch it, taste it, feel it, right? And so it got Colonel Swain thinking, and the brainchild that came out of that really was the center upon which we are in today. It initially started off as Center for Air Power Studies, and that kind of gained the traction and started the ball rolling with regard to our lab and kind of the impetus of what a multi-domain lab might look like, as well as what would the research side of things be. And so through the process, throughout the next few years, you ended up with contracts and funding that eventually got approved into taking us into 2020, where we started being able to purchase and actually install the multi-domain lab, $10 million lab that's sitting over in Fairchild Hall. And with that being, you know, kind of the forefront, part of the question started coming into our minds of like, well, maybe this center needs to be something even more. It's going to be something grander, and it's going to. So we took on the project of rebranding and remissioning it to something that captures something more than just air power, but we're getting after the multi-domain, joint all-domain operations aspects, and thinking broader of strategy and warfare, military studies, strategic studies, something that can really capture that essence, right? And so. In the fall of 20, we ended up rebranding to the Strategy and Warfare Center. And started and opened up the MDL shortly thereafter, later that fall, and was able to, in 21, was able to start getting courses and classes through the MDL. Fuego is going to take you through most about the MDL and kind of showcase it, as well as kind of give you a foreshadowing of what's to come with all of those programs and projects. But it's continuing to evolve and expand in capacity. But like I said earlier, the center is ideally supposed to have not only an immersive kind of experiential education side of the house, but a research and academic emphasis as well. And so what brings us here today is really laying down the foundation of that side of the research branch of our center. And here we are at the symposium, first symposium in 2023. And with that slide, I'd like to turn it over to Fuego and, oh, I'm sorry, nope, one more slide. I got one more, my bad. One more slide, please. There. So let me talk to you about the mission of the Strategy and Warfare Center. So you can see it up there. We're all about basically, again, getting after the joint all-domain operations at all levels of warfare, from strategic to operational to tactical. And we're looking at building those warfighter scholars that are well-versed in being able to communicate and talk about those kind of aspects. So you see on the left is a research branch, on the middle there is MDL, and 4 themes are things that we really kind of hold dear to us in the center. Things that we're looking at trying to get after in making sure we're providing the right education and experience so that we end up as warriors, thinkers, and doers, and not just airspace, but airspace and cyber as well, right? And beyond as we continue to get after joint all-domain operations. The first line of effort there is air and space power, and the joint force in the multi-domain world kind of speaks to the multi-domain lab in a lot of ways, but also what we're doing here with our second line of effort there, getting and building strategic foresight for what comes next. What's going to happen in the next 5 to 10 years in your career as you begin to grow and interact and adapt and have to adapt in an ambiguous technological environment. Another one is talking about organizational and cultural adaptation and making sure we have an effective organization that can get after those kind of things and make sure that those aspects become reality. And then last but not least, wargaming as a professional development that happens not just in the MDL, but we have a whole course dedicated to it as well. And there are a lot of things to be learned about wargaming from that perspective. All of it goes to the end of developing some core outcomes of warrior ethos and national security for our services. All right, with that, now I'm going to hand it over to Fuego to talk more about the MDL and SWIC itself. Thanks.
Excellent. Thank you, Colonel Grant. And again, thank you for the ROTC attachments making this way out here and all the other cadets who are cutting out of their time. Again, time is the most valuable resource to you guys. You guys need to realize that right now. And then giving it up and making the choice to be here as part of this symposium is something that will actually pay dividends for you guys in the future. There's a reason why we're, once again, cutting the time out for each and every one of you guys to be able to attend this. Go ahead and give me the next slide, please. Okay, so what we ended up doing in there underneath, once again, Colonel Swaim's guidance and overarching the idea of, once again, what does the air power of Hogwarts of air power look like? We created the multi-domain lab. Multi-domain lab is basically a 4-room suite that includes 2 JDOCs, Joint All-Domain Operations Centers. You look at those operation centers as places where, again, the command and control element of warfare could begin. From there, we also have the flight bays. Flight bays are contained, each of them 12 ILDs, immersive learning devices, which look a lot like flight simulators to each and every one of you guys. Inside of those, we can war game all the way from the basically operational level of the planning element to the tactical level, how to actually fly the tactics. Now, the beauty of these ILDs is they're a mixture between the F-35, a Cessna 152, and an F-22. Some kind of great airplane. We call it the F-40 down there. That aircraft is specifically designed to make it easy for you guys to fly and enable you guys to, once again, missionize and learn quickly how to do the flying so we can spend the time missionizing you and making sure you understand the doctrine and the higher levels of warfare, stemming all the way from the strategic all the way down to the tactical. This aspect, once again, will carry you on beyond just the midterm final exam. This will carry into your lieutenant years, your captain years, your major years and beyond. I got feedback recently from one lieutenant who ended up going on a Viper ride down at Holloman Air Force Base. He, in this process, got to sit in his very first Viper ride, doing 300-foot low-level experiences. In that process, every one of the radio calls he heard, he fully understood. The mission planning element of it, he understood. Why was that? Because we were able to put him in an immersive learning environment and be able to tie that to the operational side. And that is what the future of education should look like and does look like here at the United States Air Force Academy. Go give me the next slide. Again, moving on from there, that's what it looks like. Again, we're tying everything from space, cyberspace. We're in the process of creating new war games in the cyber domain that span into the space domain. These aspects, again, are unheard of in other wargaming scenarios, where we're allowing the cyber cadets to actually hack in and touch the war game, where it is no longer white carded in. This is the first of its kind across basically as far as wargaming departments go. We are going to go ahead and continue to push the limits. By 2025, we hope to have a virtual live construct where we have GPS trackers on cadets and ROTC units running across the United States Air Force Academy and injecting them into the virtual world. So a bomb dropped from an ILD that blows up on the ground and kills somebody in the virtual world will also send a signal over to actually remove somebody from a scenario out in the greater USAF area. We are in the process of tying all of this to the Naval Academy and the United States Military Academy. This, again, is what future education looks like. Each and every one of you guys is going to be challenged with what the future of warfare looks like. I'm going to, once again, promise you that the United States Air Force Academy is going to continue to push the limits to make sure you guys are as prepared and ready to ask those tough questions of what the future of warfare looks like. Slide. So Operation Northern Eclipse, as we look at our different scenarios and we look at how we operate in there, give me the next slide, please. We specifically target one specific country, looking at China. China invading the northern island of Hokkaido of Japan. In that scenario, we run multi-domain, multi-discipline operations, joint warfare to enable the cadets and anyone else who is going to play along with us the ability to actually understand the tangibility and the usability of joint warfare. That right there, my friends, is how we are going to fight. And that is how we need to prepare. Slide. So moving on from here, where have we gone? Multi-domain lab, again, sounds like a great tool, and it is a tool. It is a sandbox for us in our educational purposes, but it is also a mechanism for cadets, faculty members, and researchers to push the envelope and go to the next level. Figure out what the next big question is going to be in the future of war. This right here, what you're sitting in this symposium, is what the future of warfare is going to be based on. We are right now standing up a class, MSS 302. MSS 302 is the future of warfare and disruptive technologies. This course is the launching point, or this symposium is the launching point for that course, specifically looking at what does the future of warfare look like and how are the future generations going to fight it and how should we prepare them for that fight. There. In this process, again, we've continued to do research inside the lab and inside the Strategy and Warfare Center to include the future of vertical lift conducted for the United States Marine Corps with cooperation from RAND Corporation. We also have paired with Behavioral Sciences Department to look specifically at the idea of manned and AI pairing. So AI decision-making coming from an AI machine. And now we have to look at the relationship between the man and the unmanned aspect. So this is all the things that we are pushing forward in the Strategy and Warfare Center. And I just think, once again, thank you guys for all being here. Thank you for being part of what the future of warfare is going to look like. Colonel Grant, over to you.
All right, thanks, Fuego. So a couple things we'll hit real quick, and then we'll take a break as we prepare for our next speaker. So where we're going, a lot of times we're thinking through and how can we continually improve the MDL to be able to bring in new software, new scenarios. But we chose this particular scenario, tried to make it very realistic to and applicable to the things that you guys are going to be seeing and doing as you go forward. So with that, what I'd like to do is take a 15-minute break. We'll be back in seats around 13:40, and we'll get kicked off with our next speaker shortly thereafter. So thank you. Just for everybody's situational awareness, we'll go ahead and be starting here in about 3 minutes. So go ahead and finish up and please take your seats and be ready in about 3 to 4 minutes. Thank you. Got a couple minutes. It's okay. We don't have to start right away. Feels the pressure. I forgot to get started. All right, it's very quiet, so we're going to go ahead and get started, I guess. Here we go, guys. So our symposium keynote speaker for today is General Timothy Ray, United States Air Force retired. General Ray began his career as a distinguished graduate of the United States Air Force Academy, class of 1985, having served with distinction for the last 36 years and culminating his career as commander of Air Force Global Strike Command and as commander of Air Force Strategic Air at Barksdale Air Force Base, Louisiana, prior to his retirement in 2021. A command pilot with over 4,000 hours, General Ray flew a range of aircraft, including the T-37, T-38, B-1, B-52, C-21, C-27, and C-208. As commander of Air Force Global Strike Command, he led the Air Force's strategic deterrence, global strike, and combat support to U.S. STRATCOM and other geographic combatant commands. He was responsible for over 33,000 airmen operating at 2 numbered air forces, 11 active duty, Air National Guard, and Air Force Reserve wings, and the Joint Global Strike Operations Center. His command operated all U.S. Air Force intercontinental ballistic missiles and bomber aircraft. Prior to his command of Air Force Global Strike Command, General Ray's other career highlights include operational flying assignments in the T-38 and B-52, serving as an instructor, evaluated pilot, and squadron commander. He also flew the B-1 while at command of the 7th Bomb Wing at Dyess Air Force Base, Texas. He is combat tested leader, serving as commanding general, NATO Air Training Command, Afghanistan, NATO Training Mission, Afghanistan Combined Security Transition Command, Afghanistan, and commander of the 438th Air Expeditionary Wing, Kabul. He later served as Commander 3rd Air Force, Ramstein Air Force Base, Germany, and as Deputy Commander, U.S. European Command in Stuttgart, Germany. General Ray was awarded the Defense Distinguished Service Medal and many other campaign medals throughout his career. Sir, we thank you for joining us today, and we're honored to host you. I'll turn the floor over to you. Thank you.
Okay, can you guys hear me okay? All right. Eyeball, thanks for the great intro and thanks for the chance to come and talk to you all today. I was kind of chuckling with him before I came. So at the end of the Cold War in the 90s, early 90s, I was looking for a new job because bombers were no longer on alert. And I called here at the academy into the faculty and said, hey, could you guys use me at all? And these 2 captains, just like me, they pull up my transcripts and they laughed. I mean, they weren't just being dismissive or chuckling, but they were laughing at me, right? And I kind of took that hard. So when I pinned on 1 star, I started to get over that. And then when I retired as a 4-star, I guess I could say it all worked out on my behalf. But I come to you not as an academic. I'm not one of those well-written folks, but I have a lot of experience. I have some time in the acquisition world. And what I bring to you is really an insight of how we get things done to build air and space power. And this idea of disruptive technology, I'm going to talk about that here in a minute. So I spent about 1.5 years in the acquisition world at the Pentagon, working for then Dr. LaPlante, who was the head of Air Force acquisition, now the head of DoD acquisition. And he was really good about not making me learn acquisition. And so I found myself in the room with some really bright minds in the acquisition side of the house. And I mean, there are times where I wanted to go sit in the corner in the fetal position, rock back and forth and make low moaning noises because it was so painful, right? But in the end, I will tell you the way that things operated, the ability to see how things really get done was incredible. And so it helped me as the commander of Global Strike Command later to bring on the B-21, the GBSD, the LRSO, the new cruise missile, to re-engine the entire bomber roadmap to the point that Congress felt it was the only credible weapon system roadmap in the Air Force. And I would look back at my time as a DCOM in Europe and my time as an acting JFAC and all those things, but it all was required to come into that conversation. So I come to you really as someone with that experience. So it's good for us to talk about the disruptive technology in future warfare. I saw a little bit from Fuego, what you're talking about, and I think you're heading in the right direction. What I think really needs to happen is for us to step back and think not about disruptive technologies, but how we are disruptive with technology. I'd like my one slide, if I could show it to you. All right, everybody watch out. Beth Macros is in the house here. Okay, iconic picture if you're a bomber aviator, right? This was Doolittle's raid, the first true long-range strike in America's history. B-25 medium bombers taken off of an aircraft carrier. And so what they did was not what I would say militarily significant in terms of the targets they hit or the things that they impacted, but the strategic significance was overwhelming because it gave us a huge boost after Pearl Harbor. And it sent a message to the Japanese who knew they were on the clock before we could reach out and touch them. But we showed them right away, you're not immune, and they fought the war differently. So you could argue that we had medium bombers, and that wasn't a terribly big surprise, although we hadn't used them a lot. We had carriers, and everybody knew that they had potential. But we never put them together, and we never put them together in that context. We were disruptive with technology. This was not a sustainable model, though, right? We couldn't keep doing this. So we kind of lived off heroics to have some really innovative people do some good things. But in the end, when we as airmen and guardians think about this, we have to take a broader, more systemic approach. Okay, you can take that down. You can bring that down too, if you don't mind. Okay. So when I talk about technology, particularly with my Army brethren, right, they like to give us a hard time because they say we're just enamored with all the shiny things. But if we're honest, and if, we try to repeat to them, if you're a soldier, that's one thing. But if you operate in a domain that you don't habitate on a normal basis, you are totally dependent on technology. Airspace, sea, cyber, it is a technical game. And technology is relentless in its evolution. And so there's this challenge we see of staying abreast of how it's going and being part of the conversation. And I say that, I know this audience is probably more receptive of that, but not everybody is. But you have to start thinking about this more systemically, right? When we think about the evolution of military technology and conflict, it is not a static conversation, right? If you read the book, The Infinite Game by Simon Sinek, anybody had a chance to read that book? He talks about the fact that it's about constantly building margin and capacity to compete. And it's not a pole vaulting event, but it's more of a hurdling event. That way you can sustain capacity. Well, that takes a very different kind of thinking to stay in the game, particularly in the world we live in with Washington the way it is and how it operates. Technology is always marching on, right? So you just go back in history, there's a village, they got attacked. They built a wall, somebody built a ladder, and we have a moat, and we have catapults, and you get the story. That is the way of life, and I'm convinced that even if all this technology fails us, we'll go back to that because that's just the way human nature is. So why does it work better? Part of it is a perception and a perspective. When we were in Europe, I had the need to go and start solving the anti-access area denial problem in the Kaliningrad exclave. And for those of you who don't know, there's a small chunk of Russia in the middle of NATO in the southeast corner of the Baltic Sea, and it's filled with all kinds of hateful SAMs and missiles and all kinds of things. And back in the 2016 timeframe, we didn't know how to take that down because we'd spent all of our time and energy in the Middle East thinking about that problem. And so we had joint and allied partners in there, and we're talking about it. And I had an F-35 pilot, a weapons officer, field grader, and he was dithering at the complexity of this problem. And I had to kind of, come here, pull him aside and say, dude, you fly the most advanced aircraft on the planet. You have a PhD in integration. Of anybody in this room, you need to be leading this group down the path. Yes, this is hard. Yes, we're going to lose some airplanes. Yeah, we're going to lose some paint. But we're not going to find some elegant solution beyond what we have. And when we worked that problem, it took us months to really solve a campaign, right? That campaign was months long. But because, and to his credit, he took me very seriously and led, that team really began to pull and tug and experiment and do the kinds of things. And we can do that now in days, weeks, days, hours, because we understand the complexity of it. We understand the integration. We understand where our margins are. We understand that a lot better, but it wasn't a natural, simple thing. It took a lot of work. I talked about, where the infinite game plays, the conversation I had with Simon Sinek before I left. He said, General Ray, there was a Cold War. And in that entire conversation, it was really underwritten by three key things. It was underwritten by a nuclear tension, a philosophical, cultural tension, right? And an economic tension. And I said, yeah, that holds true. I buy that. Are we now in Cold War 2.0? And if you just think the Chinese now with the triad, and folks, what we thought about nuclear deterrence and arms control, that's actually more broken than people know. We look at the fact that they're 80% the size of our economy, their tech capability, and they do not have the same perspective about life and society. So yeah, I would say we're in a Cold War 2.0 and they are moving very, very quickly. And so we kind of have a standard to think about, right? But for where you sit, you're going to do a lot more work in this program, and I think it's fantastic. But you're going to get frustrated, and you're going to ask, why doesn't this work better? What's in our way? And there's a couple things I'll give you philosophically that will help you kind of approach things. And there's some structural things. And when I'm done with that, I'll give you a couple of historical parallels and give you some recommendations from there. When I look at innovation and technology, most innovation in technology is just optimizing things. That makes sense. Unless you have a revolution in military affairs. Does that radically alter everything? But I learned to think about things in two categories: normative technology and formative technology. And the same technology can play, just a choice of how you use it. Okay, normative technology, if you're the 1910 US Army Cavalry, you had horses. Normative technology to you was a faster horse, a better saddle, better binoculars, okay? But a formative technology could be a motorcycle or an airplane, right? And so if you're honest with yourself, the airplane could be normative or formative. You could choose to use the airplane to do the same things you've always been doing. Or you can look at it like we did and say, this changes everything. Regardless, you have to change what we call .mil-PF. Are you guys familiar with the term .mil-PF? It's an acronym we use to describe the things that really help us project power: doctrine, organization, training, materiel, leadership, personnel. And the term we use, F, is okay for facilities. I think it should be I for infrastructure. So in normative technology, you can make some changes around the edges, but a formative technology, you tear up the playbook and you start over. Because everything has to be different. Your infrastructure has to be different. Your doctrine is completely new. Your organizational structures are new. But when you see technology hit the street, the vast majority of people take a normative approach to it. And because of that, we miss some big things. Here's some big whiffs that we had. We brought on the F-22, phenomenal airplane, but there's no way you could ever train with that aircraft to its full extent. And so we should have recognized the need to bring in a simulated virtual environment that was going to let them do what they need to do. And most simulators for you all are really just safety of flight devices. You know, when you go out, if anybody's going to go fly, or anybody who has flown, those devices were never meant to be integrated for full-up combat. We found a way to do that, but by design, they're not that way. We brought on the F-35. I remember being in the budget discussions, and they said, hey, we need another $500 million to figure out how to do this intel mission data, because the sensor suite on the F-35 is so phenomenal. We're swimming with all this information, and we don't know what to do with it. That should have been an entering argument that says the F-35 means we will do things this way. But in all honesty, we treat it as just another strike fighter. Okay. So we have a choice as we go down this path of normative versus formative. And the truest expression of formative technology is a revolution in military affairs, where everything changes. Okay. And I think we always have to be looking for that, because if our adversaries figure it out before we do, we're going to find ourselves on the wrong end of that. There's also another structural thing to a degree that's philosophical, but there's this concept called the diffusion of innovation theory. If anybody's ever heard of that, you'll hear some of these pieces. But the study showed that there's about 2 or 3% of the innovators, and there's about 12% of what we call the early adopters. And then there's this big wedge in the middle that's divided between the early majority and the late majority. And then there's the laggards who have no desire to be part of that. And so before you kind of criticize those folks, a lot of those people, those critics are just really wounded optimists because of the churn of the system. So there's usually not a lot of people who are just naturally in that category. But you don't really go forward until you get the early majority on board, right? So in this crowd, we find ourselves as airmen and guardians. It's easy to find the innovators and the early adopters, but to get the entire system to think, we have to find a way to pull on that early majority. So the quality of our story, the depth of our thinking, the completeness of our analysis is the one that will win them over. And you have to win those arguments in Washington, D.C. You have to win those arguments inside the 3rd and 4th floor of the Pentagon, or it's just not going to work. There's also some structural things that I've found useful, and a lot of this is my scar tissue. I know a couple of people here were with me in Afghanistan, but trying to build the Afghan Air Force was really, really hard. Nothing worked. It's probably the hardest job I ever had. But every time you tried to do something good, it fell apart because of the capacity or the lack thereof. It's like that itch on your back. You start scratching and it starts moving on you, right? This was kind of the problem, was every time we touched it and tried to fix it, it didn't work because some things weren't there. And so in my simple mind, I came up with what I call the 4 pillars. And if the 4 pillars aren't there for us, if the 4 pillars don't really work, then I don't care how much money you throw at it. I don't care how good your tactics are. I don't care how good your PowerPoint is, whatever, it's gonna fail. And the first core pillar is the human capital. The human capital has to be the right group of people that have the skills to do what we needed to do. And if you don't have that, then nothing else is going to play. You have to have the infrastructure. That's the second pillar. And that infrastructure has to have all those things in it, not just, the runways and the airfields. It has to have the labs. It has to have the training areas. It has to have the networks to go do what it has to do. And also the third pillar was it has to have the ability, and I go back to the earlier part, it has to have the ability to manage and sustain technology. And we go, okay, I got that, but let me just give you some examples. So when you go out to the quote real Air Force, if you're going to be a maintainer, you're going to go out and fix an airplane, but you've got a calibration and a test set, or you have a part that comes off. You actually need to go back into the back shop, put that on a bench and test it. Well, that tester and all that equipment's got to be calibrated, and somebody's got to sustain that. And then all your support equipment's got to work. And so if you can't calibrate the test set doesn't give you the parts, it doesn't give you a sortie, and you can't fly. And that may seem pretty basic, but if you can't think through the totality of the management of technology, then it will fall apart. And the fourth, probably most important pillar is the ability to plan and program and think about the future. On one level, it should think about ideas like AI, man-to-man teaming. It can think about these concepts. But if it doesn't take the time to come back in and make sure that the human capital is right, that the infrastructure is right as part of the investment, and that the sustainable technology and capabilities are there, it just doesn't matter. And we get enamored by all these major programs and ideas in the DC area because DC likes money figures, it likes calendars, it likes timetables, and it likes things, right? It really struggles with ideas. But when we start talking about moving forward with technology, you really got to think those through. And my concern is that after 20 years of war in the Middle East and putting a couple of decades of future building and modernization on hold, we anchor ourselves in the late 80s, early 90s, when now we actually require a generational leap in those capabilities. And that's going to be hard for all of us, okay? I tell you that not to be frustrated, but to have your eyes wide open. This is hard to do. We saved a lot of young people in the Middle East. We stopped the next 9/11. I'm not going to tell you we shouldn't have done what we did. The national leadership of this country made a decision, and we followed those orders and we did our job. But now it's time to come back in and get ourselves ready for the next fight, okay? We've been here before, actually. Small changes in the context, but for my history majors, go back to the time right after Vietnam. And you can get a lot of these insights from the book, The Prodigal Soldiers, but at that time, we were broken. We kind of won in Vietnam, but we didn't have that sweeping strategic victory, right? We had a conscripted force that was falling apart, and it was in horrible shape. We had a horrible relationship with Congress. The Joint Force was completely dysfunctional. We were staring down conventional overmatch in Europe of the Soviet horde. We had to recapitalize the nuclear enterprise because we're facing a modernized Russian-Soviet triad. And we had some problems with who we were. If you look back at World War II, a lot of the R&D, 80% of it was defense related or sponsored or paid for or owned. By the Vietnam era, it was about a 50-50 proposition. So industry changes, it starts to consolidate, but it's not what we want it to be yet. But it still has a very strong voice and there's inertia. So we came up with Goldwater Nichols. We brought on the all-volunteer force. We fixed the joint dynamic. We changed the relationship with Congress. We modernized the triad, and regrettably, we're still using that same triad. The good news is it worked. Bad news is we need a new one. But we also took the time to step back and create an offset. That's when the stealth and precision conversation began. You know, the world that I grew up in, you know, kind of joke, you know, Swami's talking about no internet. Hey, you know, when we came here, it was a TRS 80 something, right? I mean, my generation could still do math by hand before you start dogging me, right? Or in our head, and we can navigate with a map and without an iPhone. But it was a different world. The integration required was really negligible. And we could operate, we could buy and do those things back then. Now it's a very different story. But that all played out in Desert Storm in a way that was really, really impressive. Okay. So I tell you that to say that we can look forward now, realize we have to recapitalize our triad. We need to teach the joint force to think globally, not regionally. We need to start thinking about, you know, the relationship with Congress with different authorities to you know, acquire. I think we need to think, and it's a longer conversation about, you know, the all volunteer force and deep dialogue, but I could just say daycare, childcare would be one of those central pieces, and you're off on an emotional conversation. The R&D is going to go so much faster because the commercial dollar is going to drive a risk calculus that we can never do. Not with the oversight, nor will we ask to have all that removed because that's not the right thing to do. We actually need to come back in and step back and ask ourselves, where's our next offset? You're going to talk about the data a little bit here, but you're talking about teaming, you're talking about AI, ML. And those, I think, are ornaments in a broader array that we need to step back and ask ourselves a couple of questions. In my opinion, data is an RMA. It should be viewed as a formative technology, not a normative thing. It's not cyber, right? And if you understand the kill chain, define, fix, target, track, engage, assess, the lifeblood of the kill chain, ladies and gentlemen, is data. Without data, it just doesn't work. Unless you're visual and you can pound on something, but that's not the world we're growing into. So instead of just saying, what are all these things and what are our data requirements? What is the data world we need that makes more things possible? What are the microservice techniques for managing data? What's the latency? And moreover, who's going to command and control the management of the data? Because we're going to need somebody who can actually do that, who can make sure that the data is good. That's the kind of operational doctrinal shift that I think is really where you need to start thinking about this. And then all these other things become more possible. Integrated SIMs become more possible. You know, teaming becomes more possible. Machine learning, AI become actually elements that you can leverage to do what you want to do with data. I would argue that someday you're not going to be doing as much dogfighting as you will data fighting. And so data is a foundational piece to this. And I think that's where we need to spend a lot more of our time thinking as a force. So as you go through this, think about that, but step back and ask, are we doing enough work on the human capital, on the infrastructure, right? And on the management of technology? And are we thinking about the conflict at the strategic level of conflict, then the operational, and then the tactical? Some advice. I think I owe you that. When I was a basic, coming out of basic, Cadet Daniel K. Elwell pulled me and 2 or 3 other guys aside. And so for a guy like me, my mom had to like sell things to get me a plane ticket to this place. This was like my family winning the lottery twice in a week. So I really cared about what I did at the academy. It was real to me. It's what I wanted to do. But he saw me and said, yeah, I better give you some advice. And he said, look, you guys really care. Your hearts are in this, but you're going to go out into the cadet wing and you're going to see as many examples of what not to do as you will to do. Don't be discouraged. Don't be disenchanted. Know that that's part of the landscape. Okay. That's just how things are. Don't let those people make fun of you for believing. Don't let those people make fun of you for your idealism. You stick to your guns and know, in my words now, that if you're going to be good, it's not just about you doing your part, but it's about bringing those people with you because you're going to need them because they could be that early majority that can help you understand how to make it work. You're in a perpetual game, right? And that great philosopher K from Men in Black, right? There's always an alien death ray or a Corellian battle cruiser getting ready to blow up the planet. You're going into a world that's going to constantly challenge you. People want to say, oh, this is bad, this is bad. We need to say, yep, it's Wednesday. This is what we do as Airmen and Guardians. We solve these problems. We put the best team on the field because we produce the most amazing product on the planet, American Air and Space Power. So I like how Joanna Bass, Chief Bass says it, you walk out of here, be the best version of you and be part of this ongoing dialogue about how to make it better. And as you play the game, you sometimes will get frustrated. And if you're really critical of yourself, which you should be, that's a healthy thing. Just don't let it become cynicism. You've got a great opportunity. I'm going to stop talking there and open up to, we have like 22 minutes for questions. So over to you all for the Q&A. And no, I've never seen a UFO, so don't ask me if I have.
Yeah, so we got the mics. So if anybody has a question, let's go ahead and step up to the mics and let's ask the general some Q&A. You're there. What's your question?
Hey, sir, Major Stewart from DFMI, Military and Strategic Studies. I'm a Space Force guy, so I care a lot about unmanned platforms that orbit the Earth. So my question ties into the A2AD problem you talked about. Was there any discussion with the B-21 for that not to be manned, to be less of a risk or more survivable in that environment?
Of many conversations about the B-21, you could make that case. To say that that by itself, I would say, no, that's not the thinking. When you think about the B-21, because I'll cover up what I'm sure a couple of questions. You know, I do work with Northrop, so I'm not going to give you any current stuff, but well, I'll tell you what I did on active duty. The B-21 was born of an idea not to replace the B-2, right? It's inherently more connected than anything else out there. I mean, what you think is connectable times 2, right? And you're starting to get there with the B-21. It's meant to be a different animal. So it has the ability to do a lot of things in a contested space. So that gives you the option to do other kinds of things. The beauty of what we did with the B-21, and we learned a lot from the F-35, was we saw the need for a modular open architecture for the aircraft to bring more what we call swap into it, to create an airplane with very mature technology and put it together in such a way that when you built and flew the first one, it was operationally representative. It wasn't a prototype. A lot of model-based systems engineering. And what that was meant to do was to alleviate the need to go back and spend a lot of money to modernize, right? But because it was open architecture and modular, we saw the ability that if you wanted something new on it, it was easy. I think about airplanes using my hand, not flying with my hands, but you know, this thumb represents the propulsion. And these 4 fingers represent the sensors, the weapons, the communication, the defensive systems, and signature. These 4 dimensions change radically based on what's available in technology. So if the core platform can rapidly take on new versions of this, right, then it is incredibly competitive. So we kept that idea in play and we created a modernization roadmap. And so when everybody kind of parachuted into the program with a new idea, we said, yeah, we could put you here. No, I want it here. Well, if I put it here, then you'll get it here because you'll blow up the program. But the program that's going to come off the rails, off the, production line is going to be what we asked to buy, but its upgradable, modernized capability is unprecedented. And moreover, we went to the joint staff, to the vice chairman, and I'm a little techies here, but you have a requirements oversight council. And every time you change an aircraft or something, you have to go back to this council. Well, we got the documentation for the B-21 written that says, we'll just let you know what we did with radios, with weapons, with sensors, and with the defensive systems, because a lot of it's software and plug and play. And so the requirements were loosened so we could keep that velocity. So the airplane that comes off when it flies will be operationally representative. It's not a prototype. And then when we get ready to produce, we can come back in and backward cast new capabilities. There's a modernization roadmap. It's very classified because of what it can do. And that's when your conversation about manned-unmanned teaming becomes part of that dialogue. So I won't go into say whether we've done that or not, but I'll tell you the foundation is set to do that. Does that make sense?
Yes, thanks, sir.
Yeah, that's the first of its kind. DoD has never done that before. It's never happened. And so, and it's knock on wood, right? It's on cost, on time. See how we do. Go ahead.
Hi, sir. C2C, Shira Littman from Cadet Squadron 17. My question is based on the bureaucracy of our government and how we work with the private sector, which is currently hindering our process of innovating. How are we working around that to keep up with the future fight with China and possibly Russia?
And we could be here for another day to talk about that one. And it just depends on what you're talking about, right? I just give you an example now where we just crushed the bureaucracy of building a modern capability that's going to stay modern and relevant in an unprecedented way. And the system is there as long as you understand how to work within it. As a commander at Global Strike Command, I had to understand how Congress worked. I had to understand how industry worked. I had to understand, to be successful, that is, I had to understand how the third floor and all of its moving parts, and that's the Secretary of Defense's staff, and then how to get that through the fourth floor, which is the services. If your story is coherent, if you are partnering with your industry partner, and they can finish your sentences. And I can give you an example where I'm explaining something to Secretary Esper, and then Kathy Warden at Northrop Grumman finishes my sentence for me. And that's why the B-21 is where it is. That's a major program. So it can be done. The whole system isn't broken. There's ways to do it. What's really troubling for us right now is we see where the big industry partners can do a lot of good big things. Go ahead and have a seat. You're good. There's a lot of this dual use technology kind of in this middle belt, if you will, that we can leverage, right? So just here's the easiest one is Starlink and Elon Musk, right? And how we can bring on that array of capabilities that are dual use that to some extent have been paid for, and we can pay a little bit and get what we want. But managing the requirements cycle and teaching people in our own military how to do this is part of the problem. Building air and space power is a really cool thing, but we're going to divide you when you graduate, just like you were saying, but you're really two sides of the same coin. If you're going to build or be on the support side or consume air and space power, we don't teach you to do both, right? And all of my knowledge really came later as a general officer because I was exposed to those things. So there's a coaching, teaching, shaping, pushing, pulling to leverage these things. There's new contract opportunities, things that are working. We used an innovative permission to rapidly prototype one of 4 engines to replace the engines on the B-52. I saved ourselves 3 to 4 years, 40, 50 million. That's a good deal, right? So there's ways to get things done, but it comes down to keeping the connection between industry, the military. And here's what's hurting us to a degree. A lot of our thinking about conflict is mired in an uncontested environment of the Middle East. And as I go around, I work with industry, I work with scientists, I work with other parts. And industry really wants to hear us talk coherently about what we want. And we don't know. And when you walk out of here, you just need to know that the move from where we were to where we're going is ugly. It's messy. It's bureaucratic. It's difficult. But if it wasn't, you should question it deeply, because the intellectual integrity of what we needed to do at the outcome of that probably wasn't there. So it's kind of like watching your sausage made, right? You kind of don't want to just eat it. But in the end, there is a process that does work if we're smart enough about telling industry what we want. We're clear, consistent. We've done our homework. We figure that out. We work with those involved to get the right authorities in play, and you can do some good things. That's not the norm, to your point, but there's ways of getting that done with some of these small business contracts and things that are happening. But it's a cultural shift, and we're going to have to master it. I hope I helped. The industry's running so much faster than we can now because their risk calculus is very different. What else?
Sir, to give a little top cover to the cadets a bit more, follow-up question there. I'm struck by the 4 pillars you identified. They're very much related to a concept we teach in our core international security class, feasibility, but we also teach acceptability. Is your idea morally and culturally acceptable to your audiences? Formative change isn't acceptable to a lot of entrenched interests. So industry is certainly part of the story, but you also have to overcome the resistance from those entrenched audiences, the cavalry, right? How do we do that?
So how do you overcome the entrenched crowd? It's got to be on the quality of your argument, right? If you go back and pick apart the diffusion of innovation theory, there's some criteria in there that says that those involved can reconcile the difference between where they are and where you want them to go, that trip's going to be worth it, that they'll land in a better place. I used to, when I talked to commanders when I was on active duty, I said there's really 2 kinds of change, really good change and then churn. Churn is bad change because we don't think it through and we don't systematically come up with all those things that need to be addressed. And to some of those critics out there, they won't cognitively say, hey, pillar 1, 2, or 3 isn't right. They'll just instinctively know you haven't done your homework. So it's the ability to step back and talk about an as is and a to be to make those things real so that your idea now sticks. And I tell you that because I think you're in the yes, if, not no, because business. Yes, we can do this if the following things were true. And getting those who actually have the authority to say yes and no, to say yes and no, and they usually are higher than you. But if you've done your homework, you can win that case. And so it's a credibility of your approach, not just a shiny thing. And I talked about the laggards, the wounded optimists. Well, they're the ones who've been through these stupid churns, and it's hurtful, right? And so there's a lot of work that we have to think systemically about what it takes to change. And when you're really honest with yourself, it's a big bill. But we're gonna have to paint the reality that if we don't do it, it's truly time to burn the ships and keep going because we're in a bad spot. Is that okay? What else?
Hey, sir, Bruce Byerly. I know you know me, but for those who don't, I teach in the MSS department. Here in the MSS department, we've taken the multi-domain operations to the level of an entire lab surrounding that. Certainly, the launching B-25s off the Hornet was a step toward true multi-domain operations and kind of a joint operation. But when you say information is possibly the next dogfight or something like that, I'd like to hear about your vision about how we might fight with information from one of these highly connected aircraft that can penetrate enemy air defenses and operate very closely to an enemy's network operations and bring them down that way to enable other operations to take place.
Yeah, so, data fighting, right? Data fighting, because you need to understand. So if I'm going to be good at using data, right? So right now the services are enamored with connecting a sensor to a shooter. And I'm just going to be really blunt. That's so that they can win budget battles in the Pentagon. Or that's as good as they can do. But if you're honest about data and data fighting, then you know the latency you can live with, right? You know the quality of what you need. You know the guarantee or the goodness of your data, right? Lots of tools that can help you do that. But the operator has to actually define that for those building the data mesh that lets them do that. But if you're going to be enabled by that, then you understand, you know, the anatomy of a good offense helps you understand the anatomy of a good defense and vice versa. And so your ability then to influence, right? This is a very resource intensive thing. I know I'm talking about data and it's theoretical, but if you don't have the resources on hand, or if you have a limited number of them, as in weapons or missiles, then everyone counts. So the more doubt you can create, then the shallower the magazine becomes. And there's ways of getting people to understand that if they know their magazine depth isn't what it needs to be to prevail, then they do some interesting things, right? I watched the Israelis. I worked with them a lot. I ran the ballistic missile defense. It was a numbers game. And there's a certain point when you hit that, then they were going to go do something different because that just wasn't going to work. So your ability to create doubt, to show a mismatch in the magazine depth, to do those kinds of things would be really important. Look at Russia, Ukraine, right? How many turns has that taken in terms of throwing new things at it? You're going to bring your system, all four of those pillars, into the fight, right? And I would tell you, go read the book, Why Air Forces Fail. All 14 of those vignettes are because one or four of those pillars failed them, right? So it's really about making sure that you can bring that whole system into the conflict. And the only way that it remains relevant and capable is if the data is better than the adversaries. It's a relative piece. I don't know if I'm answering your question. It makes sense to me, so I apologize if it doesn't to you.
Hello, sir. We have a question from our online audience
Okay.
from Jennifer McCord, who is with AF CyberWorks. And her question is, how has your human factors engineering degree helped you in your roles within your military and civilian career?
A couple of times it helped me get some good grades on my master's papers. That's another story. But no, it is all about a man-human machine interface, right? What are the things we need to make good decisions, right? You know, over some of my joint experiences to create what we call decision support templates that let people make decisions based on risk, and how you present that information to them is important. It helped me as a crew member, knowing when somebody was full up or when they weren't, and understanding that piece. But I think it also helps me think about whenever we train for the future, whenever we do this, we're going to have a heavy investment of that behavioral science part of this, right? For that human machine interface. How do humans make good decisions, right? Man on the loop, man in the loop, man out of the loop. There's a morality for where we draw that line, but then there's also just a functionality for how we do things. So I hope that answers her question, but it has to be part of it. I'm going to go see some clients in the simulator business. One of the first questions I'm going to ask them is, show me your human factors engineers, because we want to start talking about a different way to train in simulators. Okay, all right. And like 4 minutes left.
Hi, sir. I'm Kendall Moore from Squadron 30. Back to your last point about the data fighting. What can we do as cadets to better prepare for success in that area?
I think it's to understand, you know, some of the data basics. You know, I'm reading a book called Data Mesh, and it makes you think differently about, is it a data lake? Is it a data storehouse, or do we have other innovative ways to access data? What are the ways of thinking about sharing the data? There's some organizational norms. Some people think data is power, and they do. But thinking about what are the techniques, and you can read about data mesh and to understand the organizational implications that are there. I'm working with a data company that's very good at that. And I chose to work with them because I believe that this is an incredibly important area. And so I think that there's more technical capability. Make sure that when you're hearing the AI, ML, word salad, that you actually listen. I was on the road with a bunch of scientists, and you could take their patents and stack them up. And I think if I stood on it, I could dunk a basketball. These are brilliant people. But they listen to the soldiers and Marines and airmen and sailors talk about AI and ML. And after about the second day, they go, they have no idea what they're talking about, do they? It's buzzwords. I go, exactly. So don't get caught up in the buzzwordology. Help understand what it can do. But then there's a human interaction with it, right? Where does it really help you? And when can it be automated? What could it do for you? And no, it's really not that easy. You're going to make some mistakes. So that's where I would go with it, if that helps. Okay. Anybody else? Okay. Hey, good luck to each and every one of you. It's a phenomenal ride. I envy you in a lot of ways. I'm glad I don't have the same problems to solve as you do, but know that there's people like me who are out of uniform, who are just as dedicated to helping you and the military solve these problems. And we're here as a resource. So good luck to you, and thanks again for being here.
Thank you, sir. Appreciate it. Hold on. 1 second. General Racer, appreciate all your comments, really giving us something challenging to think about, not just disruptive technology, but being disruptive with technology. And as just a small token of our appreciation from the department and the center, we'd like to present you with the bird.
I got a camera?
We got one up there, long ways away.
There it is. Good.
Thank you so much, sir. Appreciate it. All right, we will take a short break and reconvene at the start of 14:45. So please be in your seats shortly before that for our next panel on the history of future warfare. Thank you.
No, just the moderator's getting the lapel. Everybody else will. Yes. I don't know. It's code 6. There's 2 mics, and then which needs a couple of mics. You guys can pass it around once it's yourself, and then you'll. I kind of like not really knowing what you guys are talking about. I didn't look too deeply at all the Mississippi's. At least we get the. So it's that way. My reactions are more realistic. So I thought yesterday, being the wife was yeah, in the first quarter of the book, young flag second quarter was fine. He's back. Yeah. So he was talking about back in Afghanistan. Yeah, and he keeps talking about the dudes. And I'm like, I wonder if I ever actually. Especially when we yeah, and it would to you would just be a great voice, right? Yeah. So that's interesting stuff. My wife is transition from to basically a book about forward air control. I'm like, this is awesome. It wasn't
This is a 3-minute warning for our next session. Thanks. Hey, Tor.
Supposed to be so many seconds, right? So so are you like 3, 2, 1? You're still out there. So like what would happen is. Where are they running? Stacy. Release it from far enough away. You get like 35 seconds. But if you were too close, the bomb would just. Right. So these guys first. Stand by. Stand by. 3.5 minutes. It's out there. Because it's out there doing the stuff. And so they go, weapons away. Is it coming down on the parachute?
All right, if you're going to be joining us for the next session, please make your way to your seats. I'd appreciate it. Thanks.
Social was at 1700. The first probably doesn't.
Tomorrow's at 16 to 1800.
Probably half of them just. We're like, did it go into space? Like, is it limited right now? Like, we have no idea where this thing is. It'd be like a minute to get back. Get there in like 30 seconds. Right. You can stand up and face it out.
All right, as the rest of us starting to make our way to the seats, obviously it's starting to snow and we do have some competing events going on with some of the other activities around the academy with the COM doing some other things with the cadets today as well. So for those that are joining us, do appreciate it. And those that are online, again, welcome and thank you for joining us. Today, we're going to go ahead and start our next panel, first full panel we've had for the symposium. And as we look towards future conflict, we must understand where we've been. Take a look at how the Air Force and now a Space Force and take a look back and how our organizations have previously estimated or thought about what future warfare might be like, and therefore started to prepare for or plan in order to be able to see victory in our next future conflict. So this next panel is going to be titled The History of Future War, and that will take us there. I'm going to turn it over to Colonel Matt Deese, the department head of the USAF Department of History, and he will introduce his panel members and then take it from there. Meta, turn it over to you.
Great, thanks. Can you hear me now? All right, sweet. Welcome everybody to the history of future warfare. As a historian, I have to talk about history, and General Ray almost stole our thunder. But I was afraid Steve wasn't going to be able to talk after we started talking revolutionary military affairs, but we're good. So as Eyeball mentioned, we, thinking about future warfare is not new, right? And you can see by all I just did a Google search not a few days ago and pulled off, look at all the book titles that you can find just by Googling the future of war, right? This is not a subject that is new, but certainly something that people have been thinking about for a long time. So today we're gonna talk about how we've thought about warfare in the past, the future of warfare in the past, right? And kind of where we've gotten to. We're not going to go all the way back to catapults and moats and ladders and that kind of stuff, but we'll start mostly with talking about, Dr. Brian Lasley is going to talk about the interwar period and how air power, and you'll notice the theme, we're going to be kind of air power centric here today, right? And we'll have two discussions from our friends in the political science departments and the Institute of National Security on nuclear weapons and how we thought about nuclear war and using nuclear weapons. And then Dr. Randolph will talk a little bit about Vietnam and how we went from nuclear war to fighting an insurgency, and then what that meant for the revolution of military affairs that General Ray hinted at, right? And then finally, Dr. Kennedy will wrap us up with talk about small wars and insurgency, basically getting into wars that you don't plan to be in, right? And then I'll wrap us up. We'll save some time at the end for questions and we'll go from there. So with that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Brian Lastly.
And mic check, and it works. All right, so I'm going to talk primarily about the Air Corps Tactical School. So for those of you who are not familiar, the Air Corps Tactical School was a course that was set up by the aviation section of the Army to teach aviation tactics, doctrine, and the like. And so what you had here was groups of Army officers that would come through on a one-year course, and they would learn the doctrine, and there would be debates, and there would be arguments about what the future of air warfare was going to look like. Now, this takes place immediately following World War I, right? World War I ends in 1918, and by 1921, the Air Corps Tactical School had been established. So who were they? First and foremost, they were Army officers, all right? They thought of themselves, especially in the early years, as Army officers first and air-minded individuals second. Now, as the course goes on and it develops from the 1920s and into the late 1930s, that begins to change. And especially the instructors really began to think of themselves as air officers first and Army officers second. So you have to think, who went to this school, right? Well, it is a veritable who's who of Army Air Force leaders from the Second World War. Muir S. Fairchild, Hoyt Vandenberg, George Kinney, Pete Caseta, Spatz, Hansel, Cuter, Harmon, all right? So for the Air Force Academy cadets here, you easily recognize 3 or 4 of those names right there as building names and dorm names. And if you're interested in why these kind of pantheon of Air Force leaders get places named after them, it starts at the Air Corps Tactical School, all right? So we know who they are, but the question is, what did they teach, okay? They taught air power and air warfare. They taught bombardment attack. They taught fighter tactics. They taught attack aviation. But really, as the school matured, one thing came out above everything else, all right? And that was bombardment doctrine, specifically high altitude precision daylight bombing, all right? In addition to bombing, which is great, you have to have targets. And through the 1920s and 1930s, they spent a lot of time focusing on what type of targets should we send our bombers after, all right? So they looked at the economic structure of, first and foremost, the United States, all right? It's ready, it's right here. We can look at what targets would we bomb, say, in Chicago or New York City. And if we hit certain economic or military or industrial targets, what would that do to the United States? Right? They then took those target sets and they began to overlay them against possible threats. Germany, Japan, Canada, the United Kingdom. All right, whoever else we might go to war with. All right, we tend to think of it as a foregone conclusion that World War II was going to be us versus Germany and Japan, right? No, we had a plethora of color-coded war plans. Just in case Canada got uppity, we were ready to go against them too, right? As I mentioned, by the late 1930s, high-altitude precision daylight bombing had really become the dominant doctrine. The fighter purist, the attack purist, Claire Chennault, George Kinney, had all but been ran out, and in Chenault's case, actually run out of the country in deference, in kind of almost a religious adherence to the concept of high altitude precision daylight bombing. So the next logical question after who were they, what did they become, what did they teach was, you know, look, did these doctrines work? And we've been debating that since VE and VJ Day with no end in sight, right? There are valid arguments on both sides. So again, these weren't the first guys to think about the future of war. They were the first guy to think about the future of air war, all right? So what were they reading? Well, they were reading Duhay's Command of the Air, but they were reading fiction too, right? In 1908, H.G. Wells publishes The War in the Air. They were absolutely reading that. And so I'm going to close it off there because we've only got 5 minutes, and we'll be ready for questions for me at the end.
Great. Okay, well, if a historian is staying on time, I guess I absolutely must stay on time. So to reiterate, my name is Dr. David Arsenault. I'm the Rossetti Fellow for Future Conflict with the Institute for Future Conflict. And I was given the task of talking to my research specialty, which is nuclear weapons stuff. And I was given 5 minutes to discuss changing technology and strategy in every dimension of nuclear weapons since 1945. So what I've done to get on it is I've picked one element of a debate that I think is central to all things nuclear. I think it's just enough time for me to pick a fight with every single person in this room and hopefully encourage a little bit of banter at the end. So my argument is effectively that if any technology was revolutionary in any sense, it has to be nuclear weapons. But I'm going to tell you that however revolutionary we think these weapons were, those revolutionary effects were actually moderated and limited beyond what I think we typically think. And what I want you to take away from my discussion is rather than focusing purely on what's the newest, latest, and greatest technology, always be prepared to tie that technology into something conceptual like deterrence, first strike instability, whatever things help you think about the future of conflict in that sense. It's more than just the capability. So I'm going to do this in 3 brief sections. First, I'm going to give you a very basic overview of the theory of the nuclear revolution. Second, I'm going to tell you where it comes up short and why we misperceived what the effects of nuclear weapons might be. And then rapidly conclude with what that means for our thinking about moving forward emerging technologies. So the theory of the nuclear revolution is pretty straightforward. Basically, nuclear weapons have transformed international politics in a significant way. Specifically, according to this theory, nuclear weapons have made war unwinnable. Technologically, this is a result of nuclear weapons having 2 distinct features. First, their destructiveness. There's nothing on this earth that can blow up as much stuff as a nuclear weapon. And secondly, the speed with which that destructiveness can occur. And as a result of all of this, neither side in a conflict can prevail. Even the losers of a conflict can inflict unacceptable damage. So the theory of the nuclear revolution says, given this world, you cannot win. We should expect to see a few specific outcomes. And I'm going to compress this list into 2. First, we should see less focus on what we call relative gains, basically doing better than the adversary because you can't do better. You both lose absolutely. What that really means is alliances are less helpful, arms races are not worthwhile, and territory is less useful. And secondly, we should not see major war between nuclear powers. Okay, so those are our expectations, but let's just use the past couple years to really think about how that argument fares empirically. Despite the obvious effects of nuclear weapons on strategic thinking, those predictions have universally experienced either failure or a severe challenge. States still care about territory. You might have heard about Ukraine. You might have heard about Taiwan. The United States National Defense Strategy is focused on alliance networks. Cool story to be had later about how Greenland and Iceland were essential to tracking all Soviet nuclear-armed submarines for about 15 years during the Cold War, possibly without failure. Really neat technological feature there. And currently, NATO is essential to balancing against Russia. Arms racing is still prevalent in the nuclear realm. And even in the easiest test of no major war between nuclear states, India and Pakistan have given us at least 2 crises with overt nuclear aspects to them. 1999 Kargil War and 2019 Balakut crisis. So we have this very easy, nuclear weapons, special technology. And I say this with as someone where that is near and dear to my heart. But what did it actually change if we still see the same types of behavior as before? And my argument is effectively the changes occur on the conceptual level, and you cannot understand the importance of that technology without thinking about those. So things like how much time urgency. Nuclear weapons compress the time to make decisions, but they don't make it such that you cannot make decisions. They also matter for deterrence, which is a concept near and dear to everyone's hearts in here, I hope. More on that later. So what I want to leave you with in my final 20 seconds is basically make sure that even when we hear the easy cases of how technology is changing the game, be sure to think about what is actually changing, to what extent are those concepts and their frameworks being changed, so that we can identify the actual effects that these things have, which are non-zero. I'm obviously overstating the point to be clear, but they're not one either. So with that, I'll pass it off to Lieutenant Colonel Getz.
Hello, I'm Lieutenant Colonel Charlie Getz. I go by Thunder, and I'm going to talk to you a little bit about nuclear crises. So when we think about the future of conflict, our first instinct is to look at the past. We draw analogies to the things that we know. We look back, we break apart the things that we've seen before. We start to ask deep questions about why those things went the way they went. In the nuclear world, that's relatively simple for us. There's only been 26 nuclear crises since 1945 and 2016, with a couple ongoing, literally with sticks and stones at the top of the world. But we made a bunch of assumptions about what those crises are. And the reason we did that was because we believed the scholars that come before us, right? We look to them to do the foundational work. And in our field, in nuclear field, we're talking, giants, Bernard Brodie, Tom Schelling, Nobel laureates. And we believe what they had to say, but what they had to say was the best that they had at the time with the data available. We have new data. We have new information. We have new methods of research. We need to continue to ask new questions. So in this vein, during my dissertation project, I asked some of those questions. What were the worst nuclear crises in history? Well, if you asked anybody at the time, 2019, what the worst nuclear crisis in history was, almost all of them came back and said the same thing. Can anybody guess? Weiss, I know you. You get to say it. What's the one you know? What's the one nuclear crisis you know? Cuba. Boom, nailed it. Well done. He took my class. So Cuba, everybody says Cuba. It's the one. It was the worst one. And if we can solve that one, we can solve them all. Well, that's not entirely true. In fact, my data suggests that the Able Archer exercise of '83 was the worst nuclear crisis in history because it was the only example of true inadvertent escalation that we've ever encountered. And if we do want to go with Cuba, there's 4 other crises that were equally as bad and won in exactly the same way. So when we look back and we start asking questions about the past so that we can draw analogies for how we solve things in the future, we need to start by asking, what are the assumptions that we are making about what we think we already know? And with that, I'm going to pass it on.
Yeah, I'm Steve Randolph, and I'm going to be talking about the Vietnam War. And if nothing else, I think this is the best single slide I've ever created. We're going to talk about future conflict. There are a lot of ways to think about the Vietnam War, and books and books and books have been written about it, but I've never seen anybody talk about it in this context that we are today. So to kind of work our way across the slide there, the war that we created, mentioned earlier, was a nuclear war with the ICBMs and the bombers that we had created in the late 50s and early 60s. That was the absolute expectation of that time. And what you end up with are these really beautiful, beautiful aircraft. Up there on the upper left, the B-58 is the escort aircraft. The XB-70 was the most marvelous aircraft I think probably ever built. It actually overflew my high school graduation out in California. They were flying tests at Edwards, and somebody got off course. In any case, we didn't get that war, right? We didn't get that war. What we got was the Vietnam War. And that was nothing whatever related to what we had expected going into that conflict. And we have a veteran back there who I think can testify everything that I'm saying, General Martin, that all of this stuff had to be created on the fly by the people doing the fighting and the procuring. The war we actually fought, the picture there is of a F-100. If you were to go over to the library in a large group and go through all the encyclopedias of air power that you can find, you can probably not find a less likely aircraft to be doing close air support in Southeast Asia than the F-100. Okay, but it's what we had, so it's what we had to use. And it's part of a much larger story of the lack of preparation for the war that we got and a very slow adaptation to existing conditions and limitations. In preparation for this event, I read through a history of the acquisition program in the Air Force, declassified, and it was striking to me the sluggishness with which they pivoted to the war that we were actually in. And it was surprising to me how long it took to bring systems online. It was almost like kind of a dark humor to it. It was a retroactive analysis, and they didn't pull any punches. They thought there were better ways to do things. But in order to meet this crisis, these national security requirements, the Air Force had to buy, invent, develop, or produce everything necessary for an ongoing war, from fuses to weapons systems, avionics, training programs, all at a high cost in time, combat effectiveness, and opportunity costs. And some of these systems never did work, to include the really simple ones like radios. You would think that after 6 years of war, we could have figured out how to get a radio that worked consistently and reliably, but we never did, okay? So obviously there's a price to be paid for that. And the picture there, the third picture, the price we paid is an SA-2 impacting an F-4. Obviously that's a very, very high price to pay for basically misassessing the environment and taking your time ultimately to build your capacity to fight the war that you're in. And the last picture on the left, we talked about a little bit earlier. It captures one of the really important outcomes of the Vietnam conflict. The Air Force during that war transitioned from basically a nuclear strike force to a theater air force, modernized and trained with fighter pilots now in leadership, new training programs, new systems, all brought to bear by Vietnam veterans. And it's one of the truisms of warfare is that you go into war with the force that you have, you emerge with the force that you have created in the course of that war. And among the things that changed in this situation here was really the entire capacity of the Air Force and the expectations of the leadership. So I would like to close out of my 5 minutes or so with a necessary sequence here. One is that there's a peacetime and wartime, you have to have a recurrent critical assessment of the environment. As we know, we're all deeply concerned about China, and I share that concern too, but I hope there are some red teams out there making sure that we're not missing something and preparing for a war that we're not going to need to fight. Secondly, you need technical innovation before the war so that you're prepared for the environment that you're going to be operating in. And once you get into the war, you need adaptiveness. Once you find yourself, so that you can adapt to the inevitable surprises that are just part of modern conflict. Okay, and.
Okay, thank you. I'm Doug Kennedy. I'm from the Department of History. And when I was thinking about this question as put by Meta to me, the history of future war and how we studied it. I had actually taken my point of departure at the same point that Dr. Randolph ended, that the thought was coming out of the Vietnam War, there was going to be a thought about the big war once again and building a force structure. And the force structure and training, that if you could encounter the big war, you could take care of any small wars. Something that wasn't new in our framework. I'm an Eisenhower guy, and so I think about the Eisenhower administration. If you could deter or fight a big war, you could take care of any small wars. And so since you took over the idea that, hey, in that period of time, that big war never happened as far as it was being trained for. The big war was, once again, the Soviet Union. Instead, there was a bunch of reactive things that happened during that period of time that training and that force structure and that development of doctrine did assist with. So you could talk about some small conflict like Magua's crisis of 75. You could talk about Grenada, the invasion of Grenada and the use of those forces in Grenada, or you can even go all the way and say Operation Urgent Fury and what the US did in Panama. So these are kind of like small wars that the big force structure could at least address. And so the thesis would be that what you really need, and Dr. Randolph was talking about, hey, you're going to go into war with the force structure you have, the technology you have, the human capital you have, and that human capital has to be able to adapt with whatever you go into the war with. And so certainly you could see that this preparation for the big war affected Desert Storm. But once again, when the Berlin Wall fell, there was a thought of, hey, we're at the end of history. We get the peace dividend from the end of the Cold War. And the thought was, what we have, the force structure we have is capable of addressing everything we want. And what happened in the 1990s and the early aughts is, once again, you have these small wars that you have to adapt to. You have to adapt that technology. So whether it's what's going on in Bosnia or Kosovo or OEF and OIF, so you're preparing for the future war of something to use great technologies, and you have to adapt it to support a force struggle, to support a situation of a small war. And so that adaptation is most important. What I want to end with is a quote from Michael Howard, who's reflecting on this at the end of the Vietnam War. When you're having this transition at the end of the Vietnam War, where the country is not excited about war anymore. And he makes a discussion right on this idea of adaptation. I'm going to thank Dr. Grovolution for sending this picture to me because I couldn't find it. But it said, usually everybody starts even. And even if you're not even, everybody starts wrong. So whatever our future of war, Dr. Randolph, you attribute, hey, we're focused on a couple of existential threats that we foresee, but what other threats are out there? The advantage goes to the side which can most quickly adjust itself to the new and unfamiliar environment and learn from its mistakes. So, I think about this institution, I think about our service, that are we training, educating, equipping the future war fighters to be that adaptive? So I'm just going to end with that. Thanks.
Awesome. So we'll get to questions here in a second. I just want to, hopefully, you heard as we went through each of the discussants, and I know we didn't give them a whole lot of time, and believe me that each of these folks could talk for 5 times the amount of time that we allotted them on one half of the information that I asked them to talk about, right? But when I put this panel together, and I'm glad that General Ray went before us, actually, even though he stole some of our thunder, that the idea that you have to be thinking about what's going to happen next, and then what you get or what you plan for may not be what you get, and then you have to look back at it and say, is the thing that we thought we fought, or the conflict that we came upon, really what we think about it? And then, as historians, we tend to look back, as discussed, but even our political sciences friends, we're like siblings that don't like each other. Political scientists and historians, we fight all the time over who's the best. Historians are better, but anyway. But to be quite frank about it, you have to go back and look and say, are the lessons that we learned indeed the right lessons to be learning in order to apply them to the future, right? And so when you jump off into some of these panel discussions and classes and stuff that we're going to do for this symposium over the next few days, I want you to think about the things that General Ray talked about and these guys all talked about, and think about like, well, what is it that we're thinking about in the future, and thinking about the way we're going to use all these tools, these fancy tools that we have. And are we going to fight the war that we think we're going to fight? And if we do, or if we don't, can we learn the right lessons for it in order to better prepare us for the next thing to come, right? And General Ray is 100% correct. And these guys pointed it out as we kind of went along, right? Like making these huge leaps in assumptions is messy. And you sometimes you get it really pretty right. And sometimes you get it really, really wrong, right? And so you have to be available to think about those lessons as you go forward. So with that, I'll leave it for questions. We've got about 25 or so minutes to take questions, and we'll get you guys out of here in the snow. No questions. Party Bob.
Gentlemen, thank you. Party Bob, History Department. Dr. Kennedy, you brought up a really good point here at the end about trying to know what we fight in the future, but how do we assess capabilities of our enemies to prepare appropriately? You know, I've been to Russia, I've seen their broken down airfields, their broken down airplanes. Yet when I went to USAF, I was told Russia is so capable that they'll be at the door of Grafenwehr, if not Ramstein, within 3 days of starting a war. And now we see in Poland what's taking place. Where's the breakdown in future planning with our intel or our information ops or our think tanks? How do we balance future planning with bad assessments? The whole team. I just brought up Dr. Kennedy because he just kind of ended where I was going.
Not really my field, but I would much rather prepare for the worst case scenario. So in the 1980s, I'd much rather prepare for a conflict with the Soviet Union in its heyday, and then have to face in Iraq. And I've always thought that for all the talk of the next offset or the pacing threat or what have you, we're generally, I don't want to say unprepared, but we generally end up fighting somewhere we haven't prepared for. September 10th, 2001, I don't think anyone thought we were going to get involved in Afghanistan. August of 1990, I don't think anyone outside of CENTAF thought we were going to be involved in a ground war in Asia. Korea, Vietnam. So again, I would much rather prefer that the United States military prepare for China, and then when you know, kind of with regard to what Doug said about everyone starts wrong, then we are prepared for whatever comes next, if that kind of answers your question.
It's not a good panel if there's not a little fight. So let me just take a different angle. I think I agree with the thrust of everything that was just said. I would say that is absolutely the predominant view, and on average, probably the right one. But I want to just bring it back to the core takeaway of what I was arguing, which is if you don't tie back into what's actually changing and what's really at stake, you can actually end up making things worse for yourself. And for all my political science friends, we love the term security dilemma. I cannot increase my own security without necessarily decreasing the security of my potential adversary. So the example that comes to mind for me in this case is, does anybody remember the FOBS test? China, so General Martin in the back knows. So basically China tested something that we didn't really understand what it was at first. And then over time, it turned out to be like a Swiss Army knife. It had a little bit of hypersonic stuff. It had a little bit of orbital stuff. The gist was most ballistic missiles in the nuclear realm, we worry about ballistic missiles coming over the North Pole. They go up, they come down, boom. China tested what was called the fractional orbital bombardment system. Basically fractional, part of the way, orbital, around the Earth, bombardment, drop stuff down system, thing that goes. And the fear of the FOBS was that it goes around the South Pole. And the United States was utterly unprepared to monitor the FOBS. So at first, the reaction, I think, is we need to basically put sensors facing south, be ready for this. We need to double the warhead. Like the nuclear community got really weird really quickly about this. But the basic pushback that I'm always willing to put in the nuclear domain, what changed? China can hold US cities and forces hostage without FOBs. Ballistic missile defense is not in a good place right now. There are these kind of laser-based, space-based advances going on, but if you look at the track record for ground-based mid-course defense, it's not ideal. It's not where we want it to be. So I think everything that Dr. Leslie said is right, but it's also worth pausing and saying, take a minute on each of these things that we feel like might actually be pushing somewhere novel. And then if you say, like, does that really affect this strategic balance? No, China doubling its arsenal size just guarantees more of the same. The FOBs is just another, like, if we see a bomb go off over Harmon Hall, is our last thought gonna be, I wonder if that came over the North Pole or the South Pole? Like, strategically, the stuff is still the same underneath, but you cannot just rapidly dismiss things. My tiny addition is take each of these individual changes and ask specifically, does this little thing actually matter? So if it's about, can the aircraft actually take off, knowing that they have a lot of potholes that they don't know how to fill in, that tells us something, right? Just trying to avoid the knee-jerk reaction only in one direction. It's worth analyzing in each direction.
I'll give you a couple of tactical examples too. When B2s went to Baghdad, we bombed stuff and we would come home. I wasn't there. I'm much younger than that, but I'm going to use the royal we anyway, because first person makes for a better story. We would come back and we'd get these intel assessments and the threat rings would multiply. Like, dude, how did we get more SAMs after the mission? Well, what was happening was we would go in, things would light up that we hadn't seen before. We'd add them to the EOB, the electronic order of battle. But the things that we dropped, we didn't have good eyes on whether we blew it up or not. So we just kept adding to the EOB. And this ring of death got deeper and deeper and deeper because we didn't trust our flyers. We didn't trust our intelligence assessment. We didn't trust our analysts. We didn't have access to the information from other agencies that could back up and double confirm what we were doing. We just didn't trust ourselves. So we kept doing this worst case scenario. We kept making things worse for ourselves. So in the end, we eventually got to a place where we were like, yeah, that went down. But we still would see things fast forward 10, 20 years. We go to Libya and there's an SA-5. How long has it been since that thing got turned on? I don't know, a long time, but it's definitely there. And if it does come on, that is a flying telephone pole and it's for sure gonna get me. Just leave it on the map. Didn't we learn anything? We've got to trust each other. We've got to trust our assessments. And when we have a really hard time changing our minds in the face of new information, right? Especially when other people's lives depend on it. But we need to start getting more comfortable being able to take in new information and change our minds in the light of that new information, especially on the ops floor in the AOC when we're talking about tactical assessments.
Yeah, I can attest that the SA-5 in Libya was there the whole time, 100%. We killed it every day for like 3 straight weeks. We killed it. Anybody else? Questions?
Yeah, that's a phenomenal question and one that I could easily take an hour and a half to answer. But let me let me give just a few short, quick thoughts about what was going on at the Air Corps Tactical School, particularly in the decade, let's say between 1925 and 1935. So technology, and take what you will from this, right? I mean, if read what you will into what I'm saying, because I'm going to talk purely as a historian. Technology was evolving so rapidly that we were going from the age of biplanes made of balsa wood and lawnmower engines to gigantic 4-engine heavy bombers. So, you know, did they have a secret sauce? No, I don't think so. But what they had was a willingness to argue, a willingness to debate, and at the end of the day, I would have to assume a willingness to be proven wrong. I'm reminded, and I mentioned that Claire Chennault was essentially forced out of the Air Corps Tactical School because Chennault advocated for pursuit or fighter aviation. And there became a core group of opponents to Chennault, Hal George, Haywood Hansel, and Larry Cuter. And then when you flash forward to World War II and we realize that, hey, guess what? The bomber is not always going to get through, that anti-aircraft artillery can intercept bombers, that fighter aircraft will be in a position to intercept our bomber streams. Ergo, we need escort fighters. Hansel and Cuter both say after the war, we ran Chennault out and we were wrong. And so I think there is a willingness there to admit mistakes and to learn from them. For anyone interested in the history of the Air Corps Tactical School, and again, I find this stuff fascinating. Finney's History of the Air Corps Tactical School, Hahn's Lectures of the Air Corps Tactical School, and then most of those graduates have biographies in and of themselves. So
I just want to add that the sad part is that he had to apologize. So the thing is that, do we have a bureaucracy established that doesn't look for the rebel, right? Claire Chennault, Elwood Casetta, these are guys that were saying, I love what we're talking about bombers, but we can't just be talking about bombers at that period of time. And they were run out and they were frustrated. So when you talk about adaptation or you talk about setting up your structure, I mean, I don't even know if I would embrace rebels in my class. I talk about it, academic freedom, bring to me what you can bring to me. But have we established a situation that doesn't allow for those? And by the way, that same quote I read, further down in that quote, Michael Howard in 1974 is arguing about the same thing. Was the adaptation of the United States in Vietnam so slow because it wasn't listening? It wasn't letting bubble up influencers. And that's where it happens, right? Coming from the bottom up. And why was the bottom up experiments and ideas, why was it taking so long? Because these guys developed them quickly. How come it's not coming up to the top quicker? And it's because, did we have a bureaucracy, or I don't know if that's the right word to use. So it was great that he said sorry, but the real thing was, did you really have the audacity to make the change at the time and to embrace other thinkers?
One other potential thing that might have been in play was that because Axe was the first, they didn't have to fight conventional wisdom, right? They had this freedom to maneuver and to think and to bring up crazy ideas and to test them out with each other. And then this academic environment between them developed, and because they were great minds and they were doing great work. I don't know that we, and a reason I bring that up is because I'm not sure, to Damon's point, that we can recreate what Axe had necessarily now, because there's always going to be a pushback against conventional wisdom. This first step in changing a problem is acknowledging that there is one. And sometimes it's the most difficult step, right? Sometimes telling somebody older than you, smarter than you, that outranks you, that they're wrong, that has to fundamentally be the first thing you do to move forward, can be the most difficult thing to do at all. Because sometimes you can't tell them you're wrong until you have this preponderance of evidence to bring to them to try to change their mind. Well, maybe you don't have that yet. Maybe all you have is the understanding that it's just not right, that things aren't going well. We're not doing it the way we should be. And we need to start asking the questions about why that is. Does that make sense?
I would add one other point in Southeast Asia, the Vietnam War, I think basically the political limitations on the use of air power kind of took people's creativity out of the mix. It became a matter of following the formulas established by the national commanders, and I think that inevitably would have kind of reduced the creativity and the adaptiveness of the crews out there.
And since this question was kind of directed at me, I want to close. Let's remember that the motto of the Air Corps Tactical School was progress unhindered by custom. They knew what they were doing. And then I would also add that there were a bunch of outside the box thinkers who some of them became the orthodoxy, the bomber mafia, if you will. But I'm also remember that oftentimes my major professor used to say, a lot of times the outside the box thinker becomes an old fashioned pain in the ass. And that there are people throughout the history of the Air Force, Mitchell, Ward, and Kinney come to mind, that these are the squeaky wheel gets the grease. So for what that's worth.
Major Poundstone Detachment 105 up at CU Boulder. My questions for everybody in regards to just nuclear bombs. We keep going up in size. We have a large amount of it, but let's think the opposite way. Tactical nukes, smaller in yield. In a conventional war, does a tactical nuke, when it gets used, does that change? Does that mean mutual assured destruction? Or is this going to be something that are we even prepared to respond to? Or internationally, what are the international countries going to do when that goes off? Whether it's used on your own country or on another country.
Sure. So I'll take a first cut at this. There are like 900 ways to answer that question because it matters who's using them, who is the adversary, how large has the conventional conflict been, et cetera. I would say that, so my region of specialty is South Asia. I've done quite a bit of interview work out there, talking with retired generals and politicians about, okay, how would you respond in these circumstances? And I think there are a couple of, I'll just kind of highlight my favorite takeaways about tactical nuclear weapons. One is that tactical nuclear weapons are primarily a means for offsetting conventional inferiority. There's a reason that the countries who rely on them are Pakistan, 20 kilometers of depth from its primary lines of communication on its border with India, and a much smaller military. They don't have much room for error. North Korea, who perpetually, they're moving in this way. It probably has not yet achieved initial operational capability, but they're pretty close. And Russia has made it a pretty serious effort. And I think we're all gaining an appreciation for why they might think tactical nuclear weapons are so useful. If you ask politicians, which is basically like my research, what would you do? And the answer I get in India is basically, there's no such thing as tactical use. All tactical nuclear use goes strategic. So to your question, I think that ties into your question, is this really tying into MAD? Mutually assured destruction is a condition, not a strategy. Please remember that. You don't choose to arm your adversary to the teeth so that they can destroy you. But I think what it really means in practice is you're trying to offset something that you can't get in another domain, take it up a level, and stop it from going any further. I think the important piece here for US foreign policy is North Korea and Russia are the two. China has not actively pursued tactical nuclear weapons yet. Subject to change. Fiona Cunningham at Penn is doing great work on this. I think that my favorite example is what I'll wrap with. The United States seriously tried to figure out what would we do if Russia went tactical nuclear weapons route. And the deputies level, so the Deputy Secretary of State, Deputy Secretary of Defense, basically gamed this out and they decided we'll just push through with conventional forces. We feel like we have the advantage and we'll put the ball back in Russia's court to make them risk strategic exchange. The same exact game played at the top level, the Secretary of State, the Secretary of Defense. They chose, anybody happen to know what they chose to do? This is a fun news story. They chose to use a tactical nuclear weapon against Belarus, who is not involved in the conflict. So the idea was to signal resolve, impose some cost, but kind of with unclear political thought on how that would de-escalate the conflict. That should, my takeaway is it's a mess, and thankfully we don't have any data on that at the moment, and may we not. But anyone who gives you a definitive answer is lying, because even within the US government, the two teams that work so closely together have drastically different opinions on what that might look like.
Yeah. Just really quick. Look, this is something that the Air Force was thinking about in the 1940s and 1950s is how to integrate nuclear weapons into existing war plans. And so I tell you to go and look up Ed Kaplan's To Kill Nations, American strategy in the air atomic age. So how were in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, how were Air Force leaders thinking about how to use these weapons in a realistic manner, right? I mean, after World War II, they were not hands off, we're never ever going to use these again. They were trying to determine how to integrate them into existing plans.
So the way I heard your question was in two parts. The first one was, what is the utility of tactical nuclear weapons? And is limited nuclear war possible? And so to answer the first part, the most immediate use of tactical nuclear weapons is on bombers, right? We drop bombs. We don't, do prompt global strike the way ICBMs do or submarines do. So all tactical nuclear weapons are going to be dropped from a fighter or a bomber, right? So right away, it's a bomb. Well, what do we do with our bombs? We signal, right? We deter. Deterrence. We use the tactical nuclear weapons every day, probably more than we use some of the strategic ones, depending on how you're looking at the framework. Where do we use them? Everywhere, right? The nuclear weapons that we share with our allies and partners are part of our umbrella are tactical. We can argue that with UK, we have the special relationship that we use some submarine ones, and those are strategic. But the ones we share abroad in NATO are tactical. The ones we had in the peninsula before we removed them in Korea were tactical. So our movement patterns, our ability to demonstrate resolve through signaling, tying hands, and sinking costs, we use tactical nuclear weapons to do that with. The next part of the question is limited nuclear war possible? I don't know. Nobody knows. Jeff Larson's been asking some good questions about that for a long time. A couple of edited volumes have come out about whether it's true or not, but some of the more prevailing thinking is, yeah, maybe it is. And maybe the most likely scenario for nuclear war is a conventional war that escalates to the point where nuclear use is not just warranted, but the next natural step for how to do that. So armed forces are looking at conventional support to nuclear operations. How do we integrate together with each other and do it well? Where do we build off ramps for once that happens? What kind of use of that weapon can we do and remain limited? Most of that's under an old framework, the escalation ladder framework that Herman Kahn put together for us. There's a lot of new thinking. Rebecca Hirschman put out a great article on wormhole escalation about where off ramps just show up and then disappear without warning because opportunities work that way. They don't work in this very structured fashion like a highway. So the short answer is, I don't know, but we're thinking about it, and you should be too.
Okay, I'll just pitch in real quick, sort of overarch all that stuff. The thing I would offer at this is the way that we America, we tend to think about nuclear weapons is rooted in the Cold War. And I would offer to Thunder's point that we need to rethink the way that we think about nuclear weapons. So we'll take whichever ones we want first.
Cadet Craven, Det 105. My question is for all of you, and it's how do we plan for the future of war when conventional tactics and theory are being replaced by unconventional methods and adaptable units?
Is a good example of that, right? Like I would offer, you have an excellent example of a 20th century war fought with 21st century technology in the Ukraine, right? You know, you see unmanned systems, you see the use of data, of signals intelligence, open source intelligence, literally people's iPhones, and then we're firing cruise missiles or just old school like 155 howitzer artillery. You know what I mean? So you have this mesh of, I don't think, my point in saying that is you can't really define conventional and unconventional war anymore, right? Like those are not, in my opinion, those are not boundaries that exist, right? What you're gonna have is sort of like we talked about with nuclear war, is just sort of where on the escalation ladder or where on the violence ladder do we exist, right? Are we just fighting a cyber war? Are we data fighting, as General Ray talked about? Or are we going toe to toe with our most lethal and potentially our most destructive weapons, right? And it's just a matter of scale, right? And that's where we are. You see it, I think, really accurately portrayed in the Ukraine is, right, is we're fighting with trenches and bayonets in some places and with hypersonics in others in the same battlefield, right? And now we're talking about who's going to shoot a tactical nuclear weapon or not, who's going to get an M1 Abrams tank or not, you know what I mean? And so really, I think if you want to frame that into whether or not it's a pure adversary or a regional adversary or two regional fight, you know, I think it's just going to be a matter of where on the scale of that are we going to fight and who's willing to take it. You know, you talked about off ramps and all that stuff. Who's willing to take it to the next escalation level in order to either achieve their objective or stop their adversary from achieving their objective? Okay, perfect.
Question from online, sir, from Katrina Cooley. She asks, do you think that improving technology helps or hurts U.S. preparedness and in particular intelligence operations? For example, the threat of misinformation and deception.
You don't mind if I?
Yes. I mean, it cuts both directions is my short takeaway. The United States benefits from certain technological advances in terms of remote sensing, artificial intelligence, improving our ability to rapidly analyze data and then feed it back to humans to make the decisions that matter. So there are these benefits in the United States, precision guided targeting the United States with like compensating fuses to make sure it can now do high altitude explosions that don't create as much fallout, but probably destroy the target. Huge benefits. On the other hand, up at IFC, General Schwedo's over there, he gives the standard IFC brief and is talking about weaknesses, which include things like Chinese misinformation that the United States has kind of struggled for a while to combat and figure out how do we make sure that in the information space we're doing well. So to keep it short, I'll say some of these things, the United States is doing great. In other domains, not so great. So come to IFC, hang out with General Schwedo and he'll tell you all about it.
One little bit to that. A friend of mine that I was recently deployed with used to say the future of intelligence is unclassified because there is so much information flowing around. Again, back to General Ray's point, the data that is flowing around out there, right, is so vast that really, you know, you can find and locate major Russian troop concentrations because they're posting on Instagram, right?
Yeah, I can tell they're getting ready to give us the get off the stage, but I'm going to answer both questions really quick. And the answer to both questions is to read, right? Read whatever you can get your hands on. Read about intelligence, read about past war, read about future war. You know, when I took in grad school a history of air power, I read 15 books on air power, and I came out of that and I thought, I know about air power. Now I've read 1,500 books about air power, and I go, I don't know if I know anything about air power. So whatever it is you're interested in, if it's intelligence, if it's cyber, if it's space, read absolutely everything you can on that subject.
All right, with that, we're going to say thank you very much to Colonel Dietz and the entire panel. We have a farewell and thank you gift for taking the time to speak with us today. And so we're going to hand these out to each one of you guys. I appreciate it. All right. Give them a round of applause, guys. Thanks. I'm going to ask the audience to stay seated. We're going to take a quick 2-minute pause to rearrange and reset up the stage for our next guest speaker, General Clark. Thank you.
Thanks, guys. Appreciate it so much. It was fun.
All right, as promised, just a quick brief pause there. What I'd like to do is do a quick introduction for General Clark. He's Superintendent, United States Air Force Academy, Colorado Springs, Colorado. And overall, he graduated from the Academy himself in 1986 and is a command pilot with over 4,200 flying hours, including 400 combat hours in the B-1, EC-135, KC-135, T-1, T-38, T-6, and C-21 throughout his career. He's a distinguished graduate of the U.S. Air Force Weapons School and a graduate of the School of Advanced Air and Space Studies, amongst many other educational accomplishments. Prior to his current assignment, Lieutenant General Clark served as the Deputy Chief of Staff for Strategic Deterrence and Nuclear Integration, Headquarters U.S. Air Force, Pentagon, Arlington, Virginia. Please join me in a warm welcome for General Clark as he arrives on stage.
Thank you. It's good to see you guys. You're the lone folks standing, huh? So first, I want to say thank you to the whole team that pulled all this together. I know there's several hands in the pot, so thank you for that. And really, thanks to all our participants that were able to be here. Especially, we got some of our ROTC cadets coming from other schools, other states, from all over the place. So yeah, round of applause. Thank you for being here. Helps for a richer discussion for sure. I want to thank General Suedo, my good friend. He is leading the charge when it comes to future conflict here at USAFA. So he and all of our DF partners really make things happen for us. But what I want to tell you though, for our cadets, this is about the why, right? It's about the purpose. It's about why you're doing what you're doing. You're not getting ready for the next 4 years or 5 years. You're getting ready for the next 15 or 20 years. You're going to be the people that are going to solve the problems that we don't even know about yet. And there are areas that we're going to explore and that we're going to do a lot of work in. But by the time you're the decision makers, by the time you're the ones that are actually leading the fight, we don't even know what the world might look like. So what that means is you have to have that mindset of being able to first project out and think of the possibilities and what could be, but also have the flexibility so that if that future doesn't look like you thought it might, that you're ready to adapt. And what that means is that you have to develop the skills, right? The skills of a bold, creative, innovative thinker. That means you have to be ready to fail and then to learn from that failure and to keep moving on and not be afraid to fail. You have to be ready to throw ideas out on the table that people might go, why would we do that? Well, you have to be able to defend that and to be able to flex from that and to draw from other ideas that other people threw out on the table so that you can build upon it. But mostly the skills in the art of warfighting, in space, cyber, air, maritime, on the land. You have to understand the entire spectrum of conflict. So That's all you got to do. That's the only problem you have, right? But I will tell you this, from the time that General Suedo and I were cadets, it is absolutely amazing to me how advanced you are and how globally minded you are, because you have the connective tissue. You have the ability to reach out and to understand what's happening in the world. You're able to understand what it means to compete globally, what our pacing threat is doing. You know, I know I can speak for General Suedo and I, because we live right next door to each other. We were about this far in front of us every day. You're out looking at the world and understanding what's happening. It's not just what's going to happen in the next hour. You actually do think what's going to happen in the next 5 or 10 or 15 years. And I got a quick story. I like to tell stories. So I'm going to go backwards though. So centuries ago, there was a camel trader, and he had a whole herd of camels, and he had 3 sons. And he willed to his sons, his oldest, his middle, and his youngest son, all of his camels. And when he died, they read the will, and he gave them each a portion of his herd. To his oldest son, he gave half the herd. To his middle son, he gave 1/3 of the herd. And to his youngest son, he gave 1/9 of the herd. And there were 17 camels. See your problem there? Is 17 divisible by half when we're talking camels? No. Is it divisible by 1/3? No. Is it divisible by 1/9? No. So the 3 sons started to fight and bicker, and they're like, what do you mean? I should get the extra camel. No, we should do this. You should get that one. And it just started to fracture the family, and things started happening. And they said, we have to get someone in to help us. So they got this wise man to come in and say, okay, we have 17 camels, and we have to divide the herd by a half, a 1/9, half, a 1/3, and a 1/9. What do we do? So the old man thought about it for a little while, and he said, okay, here's what we're going to do. I'm going to give you one of my camels, and then we'll solve the problem. So he had 17 camels. He gave them one. And now you divide the 1/3 by half, and you get, anyone? You have 18 camels. You divide it by half, you get 9. You divide it by 1/3, you get. You divide it by a 1/9, you get. And then they divided them up. But if you add 9, 6, and 2, what do you get? 9, 6, and 2 is 17. He took his camel back, problem solved. You see the math there? Kind of tricky, right? Well, here's the moral to this story. Some of you are looking at me, you guys are the best and brightest, right? Hopefully no math majors here, right? No, but it is. It's a little bit tricky, but here's the thing. Sometimes you're going to get this problem. And if you take the view of it from your paradigm, from where you sit, if you look at it from your perspective, you may never solve that problem. But if you're willing to first think out of the box a little bit, maybe ask someone to come in with a different perspective, and be willing to put your own stock into this, like that man did. He put his own camel into it. He came from the outside. It seemed like a problem they would never solve, but they went through it and they solved it right away. And then he was able to take his camel back, and everybody was happy. So when you're out there, don't think all those things that I talked to you about being bold, innovative, creative, ready to fail, do all those things. You don't have to do it alone either. And the most important thing that we're going to have to rely on is each other in the future. We're going to have great teams. We're going to have great collaboration. We're going to have to be able to embrace the diversity of the people that are around us. That's the only way that we're going to get there. Not one of us has all the answers, but it's going to take all of us to come up with the right answers. So do be bold, do be creative, do be ready to fail, but also be ready to work with your teammates, your wingmen, your guardians, your fellow guardians, and all your partners. And hopefully throughout all of this, You have seen the scope of the problems that we face. You have seen what our adversaries are doing. You have seen the kinds of things that we have to do to garner the resources to help us solve those problems. And you have to take all that into account, pull it all together, use your wit, your intelligence, your cooperation, and then work together to solve the problems. So those are just some thoughts from me, but you have a whole nother day, 2 more days. Yeah, 2 more days. Take it all in, ask a lot of questions, and just enjoy your time. All right. So once again, I want to thank you for being here. And I think I have a few more minutes. If any of you have any questions or anything that is on your mind right now, I'm happy to entertain them. Yes, sir. All right. Oh, gosh, that's a good question. I wish I would have known that I was going to still be in 37 years later, you know? No, that, you take a seat, please. Thank you. That's a great question. I think for me, and this is, it's not so much that I wish I had known, it's more I wish I had done. I was a pilot for most of my career. I flew for, most of the time. And what I didn't do was think about the strategic purpose. What was it that I was really trying to do? I was very tactically minded. I would fly my missions. I would understand what my mission of the day was. But what I didn't really start thinking about until I got later on into my career was, where do I fit into the bigger picture? What is it that we're really trying to do? And why am I doing what I'm doing? And, you can look at sort of the strategic, I'll say the strategic ladder, right? You start at the threat. What is the threat that we're facing? What is it that we as a country have to defeat? And then you go, well, okay, we know what the threat is. What's the strategy now to defeat that threat? What is our overarching strategy? And we have that developed, it's written right out. Well, once you have the strategy, then you need to understand the concept of operations. What is it that we are doing at the tactical and operational level to execute that strategy to defeat the threat? And then you have to think about the requirements. What does it require for us to execute the ConOp to carry out the strategy to defeat the threat? And then it's the acquisition, right? How do we acquire the items, the things, the resources for the requirements to right up to the threat? And you always have to start at the threat. And I wish, as a younger aviator, as a younger officer, that I had plugged myself in and understood, where do I fit into that whole chain? And why is it that I'm doing what I'm doing? Because when you really understand your purpose and you understand the why behind what you're doing, it makes you so much more effective. It inspires you more to do what you're doing. And it honestly, it gives you a better mindset for decision making. You make decisions now, not based on the tactical moment, but you make decisions based on the strategic purpose. And so I didn't do that until later on, as I got a bit older, into when I started going to weapons school and doing some of the things that started to broaden my horizons a bit. But I could have done that a lot more as a lieutenant. You guys are doing it as cadets, which is even better. And it goes back to what I was saying before. I was right here. You're out there. You're looking at the world. You're understanding the world. You're going to be much more, I would say, effective by thinking about the strategic rather than the tactical, and understanding how you fit into that kill chain and what your role in it is. Makes you much more effective. So I wish I had done that instead of just going, okay, what am I going to do today? What mission am I going to fly today? Even in combat, it was like, okay, here's, now by that time I was a squadron commander, so I had a much better idea. But we had lieutenants in combat who just, they knew what bombs they were hitting or what targets they were hitting and the weapons that they were going to use. but we weren't always thinking about the bigger picture. And as a squadron commander, I started implementing some things so that the whole squadron could really understand more how we fit into the whole combat effort. And I did that because when I was younger, I know I would have never done that on my own. So I would say for you, and you're much better equipped to do that, think about that the strategic picture and how you fit into it. So that's what I would do better. That's good. Great question. Thank you for that.
So I think we have one more question.
Oh,
no.
Anyone about anything? Going once? Go. Okay. What? Okay.
I know that we have about 10% of the academy going up to the Space Force in each graduating class, and I think I see a few in the crowd too amongst the ROTC visitors. Do you have any just guidance for these folks who are going off on this path, since this is somewhat new? And what advice do you have for them, since they're not going to have that common Air Force experience with others?
Yeah, well, the first advice that I would have is maintain contact with all of your fellow airmen. If you're, and the same with all of you who are going to be in the Air Force, don't lose contact with the people that you know now in your ROTC detachment or any cadets here in your squadrons. Just because you're in the Space Force, don't think that doesn't mean, and probably even more so, that you need to understand every other domain and the impact that you have on it. And the best way to understand that is to have those contacts with your joint partners, the relationships that you can build. I'll be honest, relationships are everything. And you'll learn that too. But the relationships that you have, cultivate them, hold on to them, and look at other relationships that you can build. And you'll have all kinds of opportunities to do that. Right now in school, you're gonna go to War College, you're gonna go to Squadron Officer School, you're gonna do all these other things. And when you're going through them, you're gonna do the academic work and you're gonna learn that. But the best thing that you can do is build relationships. Know your teammates, know your wingmen, your fellow guardians, and understand what they're doing. Ask questions, share your experiences with them. And every school that I've gone to, every one of them, and I've gone to like 7 or 8 or something crazy like that. I honestly don't remember a whole lot about what I learned in some of those schools, but I remember the people that I learned it with. And those people are the most valuable thing that I got out of that school, out of those schools. So what I would tell you for every one of you, and not just our guardians, because you're going to be a much smaller unit, as guardians, our Space Force is pretty tight, but you have a whole world of military brothers and sisters out there that those relationships are going to mean everything to you. And you never know when you're going to need them. I can't even tell you how many times I've walked into a room and looked and said, I know her, or I know that guy, or whatever it is. It makes everything better when you have that relationship built. So don't let them go, build them and build more and more and expand that circle as big as you can get it. So that would be my best advice, not just for our guardians, but for all of us. Probably most important for the guardians though, because you're the ultimate high ground and you're impacting everybody beneath. So you got to be ready to do it. So, but once again, thank you for giving me a little time to speak to you. Thanks to our team for making this happen. All of our Dean of Faculty team. And thank you guys for being here today. Thanks.
Sir.
Yep.
Thank you for your time and your words, sir. Appreciate helping us set the stage. We'll be looking forward to debriefing you. All right, so that's it for a successful first beginning of our symposium. We're going to end here today, and there is a follow-on social over at Bourbon Brothers across the I-25 area off of Northgate for a no-host social. Dress as casual and food and drinks are complimentary. And we hope again, we'll see you all here tomorrow. Just as a reminder, we will be opening at 7:30 tomorrow morning and have coffee and snacks just like we had today will be available. And we will restart the program sharply at 07:55, followed shortly after our keynote speaker, who's going to be Dr. Stephen Wax, currently the Acting Chief Technology Officer for Science and Technology, Undersecretary of Defense. And he will be talking to us live from the Pentagon, and we'll have the ability to ask questions of him from here in Polaris. Other than that, thank you for your time. Again, looking forward to mingling with you guys tonight and seeing you guys tomorrow. Thank you.